He was 13 years old the first time he killed. Not in a moment of panic, not by accident. He walked into his neighbor's house, found her alone, and stabbed her 58 times. 2 years later, he did it again, then again. By the time police finally caught him, he had murdered 4 people, and he wasn't old enough to drive. Tonight, we're going through 17 of the youngest serial killers ever recorded. Some were caught within days. Others killed for years before anyone connected the pattern. A few were barely old enough to understand what the word murder meant, and killed anyway. As unsettling as the early cases are, the further we go, the harder these stories get to explain. One of the killers on this list would go on to become one of the most infamous names in American crime history, and almost nobody knows how young he was when it started. These accounts come from court records, police reports, and documented case files. Some of what you're about to hear has never been fully explained, not by psychologists, not by investigators, and not by the killers themselves. We'll start with a name that once had every neighbor in his town swearing he was the last kid on the street they'd ever suspect. By the time they were proven wrong, 3 people were already dead. Labor Day weekend, 1989. Warwick, Rhode Island. In the Buttonwoods neighborhood, the kind of quiet, working-class community where everyone recognized everyone else's car, where a stranger walking down the street would have drawn immediate attention, 3 bodies were discovered inside a single home. Joan Heaton, 39, a single mother well-known and well-liked in the community, active enough in her church that she'd served as a confirmation sponsor for a neighbor's wife. Her daughters, 10-year-old Jennifer and 8-year-old Melissa, all 3 stabbed with a ferocity investigators struggled to process. Joan had been stabbed nearly 60 times, Jennifer 62 times. Melissa's skull had been crushed with a kitchen stool, along with roughly 30 additional stab wounds. The force involved was severe enough that at least one knife broke apart entirely, the handle separating from the blade and remaining lodged in one of the victims. The killer, by his own later account, hadn't come planning murder. He'd come looking for a VCR to steal. Joan woke up. What followed was a struggle that pulled her 2 daughters directly into the violence her waking had triggered. He fled the scene and discarded his bloodied clothing in his own attic, then returned to his ordinary life as though nothing had happened. The investigation moved fast. 2 detectives driving through the neighborhood the day after the murders noticed something small, a local teenager with a fresh, deep cut on his hand. When questioned, 15-year-old Craig Price explained it away as an unrelated injury from vandalizing a car while drunk. Around the neighborhood, he'd reportedly taken to wearing gloves, even in the late summer heat, in a visible effort to keep the wound out of sight. A polygraph test went badly for him. Investigators secured a search warrant for the Price family property, and inside a trash bag hidden in the family shed, they found what they were looking for, the murder weapons, along with bloodied clothing. On September 17th, Price was brought to the Warwick police station with his mother present. Detectives Tim Colgan and Kevin Collins conducted the interrogation. He resisted only briefly before his own mother urged him directly to tell the truth. Once he started talking, he didn't stop. He described breaking into the Heaton home, tackling Joan Heaton when she woke, and stabbing her and both daughters. Then, under continued questioning, completely unprompted by any evidence connecting him to another case, he went further. 2 years earlier, he said, he had also killed a woman 2 houses down from his own home. 27-year-old Rebecca Spencer stabbed 58 times in her own living room while she slept, in an unsolved murder that had haunted the neighborhood since 1987 without a single suspect ever identified. The same method, the same kitchen knife, the same signature violence. A case Warwick police had quietly filed away as unsolvable was suddenly, impossibly, connected to the same 15-year-old sitting in the interrogation room. Investigators would later learn just how close they'd come to catching him 2 years earlier. In the weeks before Spencer's murder, a family living across the street had called police, reporting a figure loitering near her bushes late at night, watching the house. Officers had taken the report. Nothing came of it. No follow-up, no increased patrol. And a few weeks later, Rebecca Spencer was dead. What disturbed the detectives most about Price's confession wasn't simply its content, it was his affect while delivering it. According to multiple accounts from people present in the room, Price described the killings with an unsettling calm, and at one point, while walking investigators through the attack on the Heaton girls, reportedly mimicked the sounds the girls had made as they died. Both detectives are said to have had visible emotional reactions to what they were hearing, a striking detail, given how much violence experienced investigators are typically exposed to. What followed was a legal reckoning Rhode Island had never had to confront before. Because Price was 13 during the Spencer murder and 15 during the Heaton killings, both, under the law, still a child, he could only be adjudicated through family court as a juvenile delinquent, not tried and sentenced as an adult, regardless of the number or severity of the murders. He was committed to the Rhode Island Training School, with a mandatory release date tied to his 21st birthday. Under the statute in place, his juvenile record would then be sealed entirely, and he would walk free with a clean legal slate. Price, by multiple accounts, seemed to understand exactly what this meant, and reportedly told people around him that he intended to make history once released, a comment that, once public, ignited fury across the entire state. A group calling itself Citizens Opposed to the Release of Craig Price, organized specifically to keep him behind bars, led by the Assistant Attorney General, the police captain who had overseen the investigation, and members of the Heaton family themselves. At one point, the group paid for airplanes to fly banners over several major American cities warning, "Killer Craig Price. Moving to your city? Beware." The case became a genuinely national story, and it directly pushed Rhode Island lawmakers to rewrite the state's juvenile sentencing statutes, changes that could not be applied retroactively to Price himself. He never did walk free at 21. While incarcerated, Price accumulated an escalating list of new charges, refusing court-ordered psychological evaluation, extorting a corrections officer, multiple assaults on staff and fellow inmates, each one adding years onto a sentence originally designed to expire. He was transferred to Florida in 2004 due to concerns about his continued violent behavior. In 2009, a corrections officer trying to break up a prison fight involving Price was stabbed in the finger with a handmade weapon Price had concealed. In 2017, he stabbed a fellow inmate with a 5-inch homemade blade, resulting in a 25-year sentence handed down in 2019, decades after his original crimes, still showing no sign the pattern had ever fully stopped. Craig Price remains in custody today, more than 3.5 decades after Rebecca Spencer's murder, still occasionally surfacing in the news through parole hearings and continued legal filings, a reminder of exactly how close Rhode Island came to releasing him entirely, on schedule, at 21 years old. To this day, no definitive motive has ever been established beyond what Price described in his own confession: theft that spiraled, without hesitation, into overwhelming violence. What remains unexplained is the 2-year gap between his first and second attacks, and the almost unimaginable escalation from a single victim to 3 in a single night. If Craig Price seemed impossible to predict, a quiet neighborhood kid capable of that level of violence, The next case goes even further, into territory that challenges almost everything we assume about what a person needs to experience before they're capable of killing. Because the boy at the center of it wasn't a troubled teenager who slipped through the cracks of an overwhelmed system. He was 8 years old, and to this day, nobody has been able to fully explain why. Musahari is a small, poverty-stricken village in the Indian state of Bihar, the kind of place where families depend entirely on each other for survival, where a lost wage or a shunned reputation can mean the difference between getting by and going hungry. It was into this world in 1998 that Amarjeet Sada was born, the son of laborers who struggled constantly just to keep food on the table. By most accounts, he was a solitary child. He kept to himself, wandered the village alone, climbed trees, avoided the other children, and the other children, in turn, largely avoided him. He had a reputation, even before any of this began, for minor bad behavior, bullying, occasional theft, a temperament that unsettled some of the adults around him. Nothing anyone considered dangerous, just a difficult kid in a village full of difficult circumstances. In 2006, when Amarjeet was 8 years old, his aunt came to stay with the family, bringing her infant daughter along with her. One afternoon, left alone with the baby while the adults were occupied elsewhere, Amarjeet began pinching and slapping her, according to later accounts, deriving a visible, unsettling satisfaction from her crying. What happened next escalated far beyond anything anyone would have anticipated. He strangled the infant to death. When the child was found, according to several accounts of the case, Amarjeet admitted what he had done almost immediately, without being pressed. His family's response was not to contact the authorities. Instead, according to reporting on the case, they treated it as a private matter. His father reportedly punished him personally, and the rest of the family, including the aunt whose daughter had just been killed, agreed to keep the death quiet rather than involve the police. In a community where a scandal like this could mean the family being shunned entirely, losing what little economic footing they had, the calculation, however difficult to accept from the outside, was that silence protected everyone who remained. It also meant nothing stopped him. Some months later, a second infant died in the village under similar circumstances. Accounts differ on whether this second victim was another young cousin, or, as several sources describe, Amarjeet's own infant sister, born not long before the killings began. What multiple accounts agree on is that the pattern repeated, an infant left in Amarjeet's presence, and a death that followed. It was the third killing that finally brought him to the attention of the police, because for the first time, his victim wasn't a relative. A 6-month-old girl from another family in the village, generally identified in reporting as Khushbu, had been left sleeping at a local nursery while her mother stepped away to run an errand. When the mother returned to collect her, the child was gone. She searched frantically, drawing in neighbors to help, until, according to multiple accounts, a member of Amarjeet's own extended family, apparently aware of what had likely happened, suggested they call the police immediately rather than continue searching informally. When officers arrived and began asking around the village, they found Amarjeet playing nearby and called him over, asking casually whether he knew anything about the missing child. According to reporting from the time, he answered without hesitation, telling them plainly that he knew exactly where she was, because he had killed her earlier that day. What followed at the police station has become one of the most widely cited, almost disorienting details of the entire case. Amarjeet reportedly refused to elaborate on what he'd done until officers gave him a packet of biscuits. Once he had them, he described the killing calmly and in detail. That he had taken the baby to a nearby field, strangled her, and when she hadn't reacted with what he apparently felt was sufficient distress, used a rock or brick to strike her before burying her body in the grass. He then led investigators directly to the location and helped them recover her remains. The lead investigator on the case would later describe, in interviews given afterward, a specific unease that stayed with him. Not the violence itself, but Amarjeet's demeanor throughout the entire process. He was quiet, but he smiled constantly whenever anyone spoke to him, showing what investigators and later psychologists would describe as a near-total absence of the fear, confusion, or distress that would typically accompany a child being questioned by police about a killing. As word spread through the village, the earlier deaths, the two infants whose loss the community had quietly grieved as ordinary, if painful, tragedies, were suddenly viewed in an entirely different, far darker light. It became clear that Amarjeet had killed at least 3 times, possibly more, and that his own family had concealed at least one of those killings rather than involve the authorities. A psychologist brought in to evaluate him, working to understand what could possibly explain behavior like this in a child so young, diagnosed him with what was described as a sadistic personality, someone who derived genuine pleasure from causing harm, along with a broader conduct disorder that appeared to leave him without any functional sense of right or wrong. Some assessments raised the possibility of chemical imbalances or profound emotional neglect during infancy contributing to the pattern, though experts involved in the case were careful to note that these remained hypotheses rather than confirmed explanations. No documented history of extreme physical abuse against Amarjeet himself was ever firmly established, a detail that has made his case particularly difficult for criminologists to categorize using the frameworks typically applied to child violence, which usually point toward severe abuse or trauma as a primary driver. Because of his age, Indian law prevented any formal criminal prosecution or imprisonment. Reports differ on the exact length of his confinement. Some accounts describe a juvenile sentence of only a few years, while others state he remained in a children's home under supervision until reaching adulthood. What's consistently reported is that he was released as a young adult, generally cited around 2016, at which point, under Indian juvenile confidentiality protections, his identity was legally protected and his subsequent whereabouts were never made public. No verified reporting exists, tracking what became of him afterward. Whether he built an ordinary life under a new identity, whether the isolation of institutional care meaningfully changed him, or whether he ever hurt anyone again, none of it is known, and given the legal protections in place, none of it may ever be confirmed. Amarjeet Sada's case is widely cited as the youngest confirmed instance of serial killing in recorded history. But what makes it so difficult to sit with isn't simply his age. It's the near-total absence of the explanations that usually accompany cases like this. No confirmed history of extreme abuse. No clear environmental catalyst beyond ordinary poverty, of the kind millions of children in similar circumstances experience without ever becoming capable of this. Just a quiet, solitary 8-year-old, 3 dead infants, and a diagnosis that, more than 15 years later, still raises far more questions than it resolves. If Sada's case unsettles because there's no visible cause behind it, the next case unsettles for almost the opposite reason, because the people closest to the killer insisted, for years afterward, that the warning signs had been there all along, plainly visible, and simply ignored. St. Martin's, Missouri, is a rural, ranch-like community just west of the state capital, the kind of place where kids grow up riding bikes between each other's houses, where 4 doors down might as well be next door. It was in exactly that kind of closeness that 9-year-old Elizabeth Olton and 15-year-old Alyssa Bustamante knew each other. not as strangers, but as genuine, familiar neighbors. Elizabeth often came over to play with Alyssa and her younger siblings. There was no history of conflict between them. No warning sign the Olton family could point to. Just an ordinary friendship between an ordinary teenager and the little girl down the street. Alyssa's own home life had been anything but ordinary, even if it looked stable from the outside by the time of the murder. Her mother, Michelle, struggled with drug and alcohol addiction that had led to her own criminal charges and jail time. Her father, Caesar, was serving a 10-year sentence for felony assault. Michelle had given birth to Alyssa in California at 15 years old, the same age Alyssa would be when she killed. In 2002, Alyssa's grandparents, Gary and Karen Brooke, took legal custody of her and her 3 younger siblings, relocating the children away from that instability to the rural Missouri property where the family would eventually settle. By most outward measures, it worked. Alyssa became an A and B student. She looked to almost everyone around her like a normal teenager who had simply had a rough start. Underneath that surface, something else had been building for years. Around 2007, friends began noticing changes in her. She was hospitalized after a suicide attempt and spent 10 days in a mental health facility, and was placed on antidepressants afterward. On her MySpace and YouTube profiles, she began listing her hobbies, in writing, as cutting and killing people. She posted a photograph of herself with fake blood smeared around her mouth, 2 fingers shaped like a gun pressed to her own head. Friends who saw these posts largely read them the way teenagers often read each other's darker online personas, as performance, as edge, as nothing that needed to be taken at face value. On the evening of October 21st, 2009, Alyssa sent her 6-year-old sister Emma to Elizabeth's door to ask if she could come over and play. Elizabeth's mother, Patricia Price, watched her daughter leave for the Bustamante house at 5 o'clock, the last time she would see her alive. Alyssa told Elizabeth she had a surprise waiting for her in the woods behind their homes. She led her in, leaving her own younger sister outside. And there, away from anyone who could see or hear, she strangled Elizabeth, cut her throat, and stabbed her 8 times in the chest. Later, in a police interrogation that would be recorded on video, Bustamante described the exact moment the decision was made, around 5:30 that evening, seeing Elizabeth, and simply knowing, in that instant, that she was going to kill her. When Elizabeth failed to come home by 6, Patricia Price knew immediately that something was wrong. A search began that night and stretched across the following days, drawing in local law enforcement, community volunteers, and eventually the FBI. Suspicion fell on Bustamante quickly. She'd been one of the last people to see Elizabeth alive, and the day after the disappearance was reported, FBI agents came to question her directly and searched the Bustamante family home. During that search, investigators found something in the yard, a shallow, rectangular hole, clearly dug by hand, hidden in the woods behind the property. When asked about it, Bustamante told them simply that she liked digging holes in the woods. It wasn't the grave. A second hole nearby, more hastily dug, rounder in shape and covered with leaves, held Elizabeth's body, recovered under 5 or 6 inches of dirt, marks, and stab wounds visible on the body when the medical examiner's team uncovered her. What ultimately broke the case wasn't a confession volunteered freely. It was a journal seized from Alyssa's bedroom during that same search. She had tried to blot out one entry with pen ink, scribbling over it heavily enough that it looked, at a glance, deliberately obscured. Forensic investigators were able to recover the original writing underneath. Dated October 21st, the day Elizabeth disappeared. It read, in Alyssa's own handwriting, she had just killed someone, strangled them, slit their throat, and stabbed them, and didn't know how to feel about it in the moment. She described the act itself, in her own words, as thrilling. That once you got past the initial shock of what you were doing, it became, in her phrasing, enjoyable. She noted she was feeling nervous and shaky. And then, in the same entry, she wrote that she needed to go to church. She did. On the night she killed Elizabeth Olton, Alyssa Bustamante attended a church dance with her congregation while search parties combed the woods less than a mile from where she had buried the girl's body. 2 days after Elizabeth's disappearance, confronted with the physical evidence and the journal, Bustamante led investigators directly to the grave. She was initially charged with first-degree murder and was scheduled to be tried as an adult. In January of 2012, just weeks before that trial was set to begin, she pleaded guilty instead to an amended charge of second-degree murder along with armed criminal action. In court, when the judge asked her directly to describe what happened, she stated plainly that she had stabbed Elizabeth in the chest, and confirmed, when asked, that she had cut the girl's throat and understood exactly what she was doing at the time. At her sentencing hearing, the forensic pathologist who performed the autopsy, a doctor with more than 3,000 autopsies to his name, testified in detail about the injuries: strangulation, a slit throat, multiple stab wounds to the chest, evidence suggesting the strangulation likely came first. The prosecuting attorney specifically cited the diary entry as proof this hadn't been an impulsive act, that Bustamante had reflected on the killing beforehand, and had, in fact, dug the first grave 5 days before Elizabeth was killed in it. He asked the court for a sentence of life in prison for the murder charge, plus an additional 71 years for the armed criminal action, a number he explained by calculating the average lifespan of a woman at 80, minus the 9 years Elizabeth had already lived, representing every year that had been taken from her. Elizabeth's grandmother, present in the courtroom in a wheelchair, called out that Bustamante should be released from prison the same day Elizabeth was released from her grave. Alyssa's own grandmother ran from the courtroom crying. The judge sentenced Bustamante to life in prison, plus 30 consecutive years for the armed criminal action, meaning that even if she is ever paroled from the life sentence, she still faces the additional 30-year term separately. Multiple mental health professionals who evaluated her testified consistently to a diagnosis of major depressive disorder and borderline personality disorder, along with a documented history of self-harm. Every doctor who examined her agreed on one point specifically, that despite her diagnoses, she understood clearly, at the time of the killing, the difference between right and wrong. At sentencing, Bustamante apologized, but the contrast between that apology and the enthusiasm in her diary entry, combined with what witnesses described as a notable lack of emotion in the courtroom, led many people following the case, including the judge himself, to question how genuine that apology actually was. In the years since, Bustamante's case has become entangled in a much larger legal battle over how America handles juvenile life sentences. A landmark 2005 Supreme Court ruling had already banned the death penalty for crimes committed by minors. A separate 2012 ruling went further, determining that no juvenile could be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for any crime, opening a path that eventually made Bustamante eligible for a parole hearing years into her sentence. In 2024, under a Missouri law specifically intended to give juvenile offenders earlier access to parole consideration, Bustamante's case came up for review. Elizabeth's family, still actively advocating against her release more than a decade later, successfully pushed lawmakers to close that path for offenders like her. Legislation was signed the same year, specifically excluding those convicted of both first and second-degree murder from that parole opportunity going forward. The hearing, controversially, proceeded anyway, since the new law hadn't been signed in time to prevent it. She was denied. Her next opportunity for parole review isn't scheduled until 2029, and even if granted at that hearing, she would still need to serve out her consecutive 30-year sentence separately, with 15 years of that term required before she'd even become eligible for release from it. Under the most favorable possible scenario available to her under current law, Bustamante's earliest realistic release date is 2059, at which point she would be 65 years old, having spent 50 years in custody for a murder she committed at 15. She remains incarcerated today at the Chillicothe Correctional Center in Missouri. Unlike several other names on this list, Bustamante's case resists any narrative of clean rehabilitation. What it offers instead is something harder to sit with, a clinical diagnosis that explains some of what happened without excusing any of it, a documented moment of premeditation, a grave dug 5 days in advance, and a journal entry, written in her own hand within hours of the killing, that described the act of taking a 9-year-old's life as, in her own word, enjoyable. Not every case on this list unfolds within a single incident, though. Some killers operated patiently, across years, refining their methods with each new act. And the next case belongs to one of the earliest documented examples of exactly that pattern in recorded criminal history. Buenos Aires, at the turn of the 20th century, was a city being remade almost overnight. Waves of Italian and Spanish immigrants poured into the port, filling working-class neighborhoods like Almagro and Parque Patricios faster than the city's infrastructure, or its social institutions, could keep pace with. It was into this crowded, chaotic growth, on Halloween of 1896, that Cayetano Santos Godino was born, the youngest of a large family of Calabrian immigrants struggling to get by. His childhood offered almost no shelter from the world around it. His father, Fiore Godino, was an alcoholic laborer who had contracted syphilis before Cayetano's birth, a detail some later medical assessments suggested may have contributed to the serious health problems and short stature Cayetano experienced from infancy onward. Fiore beat him regularly. Cayetano's older brother Antonio, himself an alcoholic, frequently joined in those beatings rather than shielding him from them. By the time he was old enough for school, Cayetano was already spending most of his time on the street instead of in a classroom. He was expelled repeatedly for disruptive behavior and showed no interest in academics, drifting instead through the neighborhoods surrounding his family's home. The earliest warning signs showed up not in violence toward people, but in what he did to animals. He began killing cats and small birds, and on at least one occasion, his own father discovered a dead bird hidden inside one of Cayetano's shoes, along with a box under his bed containing the remains of several others, evidence of a habit he'd been keeping carefully out of sight. Fiore reported his own son to the authorities over it. Nothing came of that report beyond a brief scare. His first documented act of violence against a person came in September of 1904, when Cayetano was just 7 years old. He lured 2-year-old Miguel de Paola to a deserted lot, beat him severely, and threw him onto a patch of thorns. A police officer passing by happened to witness the assault and brought both boys to the local station, where their mothers arrived to collect them separately. No lasting consequence followed. He was 7, and adults around him still largely read this as an isolated, disturbing incident rather than the start of a pattern. It wasn't isolated. Over the following 2 years, Cayetano's attacks on toddlers in his neighborhood escalated steadily, each one more deliberate than the last. He attacked 18-month-old Ana Neri, a neighbor. He lured 2-year-old Severino Gonzalez to a wine cellar across from a local school, submerged the boy in a horse trough, and covered it with a board in an attempt to drown him. Gonzalez survived. He convinced 2-year-old Roberto Russo to follow him to a nearby store with the promise of buying him candy, then led him instead to a field, tied his feet, and strangled him with a cord pulled from his own pants. Russo, too, survived, and Cayetano was released for lack of sufficient evidence to hold him. He burned 22-month-old Julio Bate's eyelids with a lit cigarette, in an assault his mother witnessed directly, though Cayetano fled before police arrived. By this point, Cayetano's parents, exhausted by his behavior and increasingly disturbed by other troubling signs, including reported compulsive and violent impulsivity, made the decision to hand him over to police custody themselves. He was sent to a juvenile reformatory in Marcos Paz, where he spent 3 years and learned, for the first time, to read and write. He was released just after his 14th birthday, in December of 1911, reportedly at his own parents' request. They wanted him back home. His father found him a factory job. He kept it for 3 months before his behavior made it impossible to continue. What followed, across 1912, escalated into the string of crimes that would make him infamous. He'd also developed, alongside the violence toward children, a fascination with fire. He later admitted, in his own words, that he simply enjoyed watching firefighters battle the flames he set. On January 17th, he broke into a cellar on the affluent Avenida Corrientes and set it ablaze, a fire that took firefighters up to 4 hours to bring under control. Days later, on January 26th, the body of 13-year-old Arturo Larora was discovered inside an empty rental house. Beaten, half undressed, a length of cord still tied around his neck. He'd been reported missing only the day before. Cayetano would later confess to this killing as well. On March 7th, he attacked 5-year-old Reina Bonita Vainikoff, setting her dress on fire. She suffered severe burns and died 16 days later at the hospital. Between her death and his eventual capture, Cayetano set off several more fires across the city, alongside continued assaults that stretched his pattern of violence further still. His final, and perhaps most chilling, killing came that December. He lured 3-year-old Gesualdo Giordano to a rural property, cornered him, knocked him to the ground, and pinned him down with a knee to the chest. He removed the cord he wore as a belt, wrapped it around the boy's neck 13 times, and strangled him. Believing, apparently, that this wasn't enough to guarantee the boy was dead, Cayetano left the scene, walked to a nearby location specifically to find a nail, and returned. He hammered the nail directly into the side of Giordano's skull, then hid the body. The boy's father found him only minutes later. That evening, Cayetano reportedly attended the wake for the child he had just killed, and at one point touched the exact spot on the boy's skull where he had driven in the nail. His capture came almost immediately afterward. A neighbor, Maria Giordano, a relative of the boy's family, had grown suspicious of Cayetano's behavior and proximity to the crimes. Police, who had already been quietly watching him given his history, moved in. In the early hours of December 3rd or 4th, 1912, they raided the Godino family home. Inside his pants, they found remnants of the cord he had used to strangle Giordano. Confronted with it, Cayetano confessed, not just to Giordano's murder, but to all 4 killings. Along with numerous additional attempted murders investigators had never definitively connected to a single suspect. He was 15 years old. The public, learning that the culprit behind more than a year of terror was a teenager, reacted with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Many called for capital punishment. Because of his age, 2 judges instead ordered him committed to the Hospicio de las Mercedes, a mental hospital, where doctors of the era, heavily influenced by the pseudoscientific theories of Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso, who believed physical features could reveal inherent criminality, became fixated on Cayetano's unusually large ears as a supposed root cause of his violence, which is how he earned the nickname that followed him for the rest of his life, El Petiso Orejudo, the big-eared midget. While institutionalized, he attacked two vulnerable patients, one confined to a wheelchair, another bedridden, and made repeated escape attempts. In response, the Court of Appeals in San Isidro unanimously ordered him transferred out of the hospital entirely and into the Penitenciaria Nacional in Buenos Aires, where he remained until 1923. That year, he was moved to a far more remote destination, the Ushuaia Penitentiary, in the southernmost reaches of Tierra del Fuego province, a prison so isolated it was known locally as the prison at the end of the world. Doctors there, still operating under Lombroso's discredited theories, subjected Cayetano to surgery in 1927, specifically intended to reduce the size of his ears, believing it might curb his violent tendencies. It changed nothing about his behavior. In 1933, he was severely beaten by fellow inmates after killing two cats that the prison population had adopted as pets. He requested parole in 1936. Prison doctors denied it, describing him in their evaluation as perverse, degenerate, and dangerous. Cayetano Santos Godino died at Ushuaia Penitentiary in November of 1944, at 48 years old, having spent more than 3 decades in custody since his arrest, one of the longest documented periods of confinement for a juvenile offender anywhere in South American history. The circumstances of his death remain murky. Several accounts suggest he was killed by fellow inmates, though this has never been definitively confirmed. What's frequently overlooked in discussions of Godino's case is the sheer length of the timeline involved. Unlike many of the killers on this list, his violence didn't emerge suddenly in a single dramatic act. It escalated gradually over nearly a decade, beginning with cruelty toward birds and cats hidden in a shoebox under his bed, progressing through years of non-fatal assaults on toddlers that police and family repeatedly failed to stop, and only in his final year culminating in the killings that made him infamous. It's a pattern modern criminal psychology now recognizes immediately as an escalating warning sign. In 1912, no framework existed to recognize it at all, and even after his arrest, the era's best scientific minds spent their efforts searching for the answer in the shape of his ears, rather than in the years of unaddressed violence that had led directly to that hospital examination room. The next case moves forward almost a full century to a killer who came dangerously close to walking free entirely, undone, in the end, by a single moment of overconfidence he never saw coming. Allentown, Pennsylvania, had never had a serial killer before. That fact alone made the 11-month span between August 1992 and July 1993 feel almost impossible to a community that considered itself safe from this kind of predator, until Harvey Miguel Robinson became the first, and forced the city to reckon with exactly how close it had come to never catching him at all. Robinson's childhood offered a grim preview of what was coming. His father, an alcoholic musician, physically and emotionally abused Robinson's mother until she eventually left the family. That same father would later be incarcerated for beating his own mistress to death so severely that police reports described her as nearly unrecognizable, a detail that meant Robinson grew up with an almost direct blueprint for the violence he would go on to commit himself. Robinson was first arrested at 9 years old. Throughout school, despite showing some genuine promise, he was athletic and won awards for his essay writing. He also exhibited severe conduct disorder, marked by threats, outbursts, and a documented inability to distinguish right from wrong that intensified steadily as he got older. He was arrested multiple times for burglary and resisting arrest well before his killing spree began, developing, according to those who evaluated him, a clear taste for being feared by the people around him. His first murder came in August of 1992. 29-year-old Joan Burgart, a nurse's aide, was found dead in her Allentown apartment, having been raped and bludgeoned with more than 30 blows to the head. Investigators believed Robinson had likely burglarized her apartment days before the murder itself, suggesting he'd scouted the location in advance rather than selecting her at random in the moment. Her body went undiscovered for some time. It was ultimately a neighbor's complaint about her stereo playing continuously for 3 days that prompted a welfare check. Between that killing and his second, Robinson was actually institutionalized for close to a year on an unrelated juvenile burglary charge, a detail that, in hindsight, represents one of the case's most painful near misses. He had no documented history of mental illness at the time, nothing that flagged him internally as a violent predator rather than simply a repeat juvenile offender. He served his time and was released, and within roughly 10 months, he killed again. On June 9, 1993, 15-year-old Charlotte Schmoyer, a newspaper carrier for the Morning Call and a student at Deerruff High School, failed to complete her delivery route. A neighbor waiting for her own paper noticed Schmoyer's cart abandoned between 2 parked cars and called the police. Officers found her bicycle discarded nearby, along with her portable radio, clear signs something had gone terribly wrong only blocks from her own home. Hours later, following a tip, investigators and the district attorney himself followed a trail of blood into a wooded area near the East Side Reservoir, discovering a discarded shoe along the way. Schmoyer's body was found in the woods behind a nearby elementary school. She had been raped and stabbed at least 22 times, her throat slashed. Investigators would later realize something chilling about the location. Schmoyer had been abducted almost exactly where an earlier attack had taken place, suggesting Robinson had returned to relive an earlier crime and simply seized the opportunity when he spotted her. A tall young woman, matching a physical type investigators believed he specifically favored. A month later, on July 14th, 47-year-old grandmother Jessica Jean Fortney became his third and final murder victim, raped and strangled to death inside her own bedroom. By this point, Robinson had also attacked 2 victims who survived, critical, if not yet understood, threads that would ultimately unravel him. One was a 5-year-old girl he had stalked for days before breaking into her home, raping and choking her, and leaving her for dead. She survived the attack. The other was Denise Sam Calley, attacked in her own Allentown home on June 28th, while her husband was away. She woke to find Robinson inside her house, ran for the front door, and was caught and raped on her own front lawn, punched repeatedly as she continued fighting back throughout the assault. She eventually broke free and ran for help, and Robinson fled the scene. Sam Calley's survival, and her decision afterward to have a home alarm system installed, would prove to be the turning point in the entire case. On July 18th, 4 days after killing Fortney, Robinson attempted to break into her home again, presumably to finish what he'd started. The alarm blared, and he ran. Terrified, Sam Calley reported the attempted break-in to police, who made the decision to station a young officer, Brian Lewis, inside her home overnight in case her attacker tried again. He did. On July 31st, Robinson entered through a window and was met by Officer Lewis, triggering an exchange of gunfire inside the house. Robinson fled, wounded, but the injury forced his hand. He sought treatment at Lehigh Valley Hospital for lacerations from broken glass, and it was there that his identity was finally confirmed and he was taken into custody. What followed was one of the earliest major American criminal cases to be definitively resolved through DNA evidence. Investigators matched semen samples recovered from Burghardt, Schmoyer, Sam Cully, Fortney, and the surviving 5-year-old girl directly to Robinson's blood profile once he was in custody. Forensic science, still relatively new to courtrooms at the time, but conclusive enough to eliminate any real doubt. Sam Callie herself had also identified him directly, recognizing both his voice and the bite marks he'd left on her during the assault. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, along with attempted homicide, rape, burglary, and criminal trespass. Robinson was convicted in November of 1994, a month before he turned 20. He was sentenced to death for all 3 murders, making him, at the time, the youngest person ever sentenced to death for serial murder in American history. The legal aftermath of his sentencing stretched across the following 2 decades. His death sentences for the Burghardt and Schmoyer murders were eventually vacated on procedural grounds. A Lehigh County judge determined the trial jury hadn't received proper instructions regarding aggravating circumstances, and he was resentenced to life imprisonment for Burghardt's murder, specifically because he had been 17, not yet an adult, at the time of that killing. In 2012, facing renewed proceedings in the Schmoyer case, Robinson agreed to waive his remaining appeal rights in exchange for a second life sentence, rather than risk another death penalty verdict. His death sentence for Fortney's murder, however, was upheld by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court as recently as 2013 and remains active today, meaning Robinson currently holds both life sentences and an unresolved capital sentence simultaneously, a legal situation almost as unusual as the case itself. Robinson's defense across years of appeals has argued that he suffers from undiagnosed brain damage and that his trial counsel failed to present that evidence adequately during sentencing, claims that have been repeatedly rejected by state courts. Court records paint a portrait of someone who understood exactly how to manage the adults around him. Probation officers who supervised him prior to the killings described him as capable of putting on a convincing show of compliance, specifically to keep authorities from looking too closely, while showing no real change in the underlying behavior that had concerned them from the start. Robinson remains incarcerated today at SCI Phoenix in Pennsylvania, a documented case study in exactly how much damage can be done in the narrow window between a young offender's early red flags and the moment an overwhelmed system finally, belatedly, catches up to them. The next case takes us across the Atlantic, to one of the most infamous names on this entire list, a child whose crimes permanently reshaped what an entire country believed a 10-year-old was capable of. Scotswood, an inner-city slum neighborhood of Newcastle upon Tyne in the summer of 1968, was the kind of place where children largely raised themselves, playing unsupervised in derelict houses and demolition rubble scattered across the district. Adults, too, preoccupied with their own hardships, to keep close track of where their kids wandered. To understand what happened that summer, it helps to understand what had already happened to Mary Bell long before it. She was born in 1957, the daughter of a teenage local prostitute, Betty McCricket, who, according to an aunt who later spoke with biographer Gitta Serini, reacted to her own newborn daughter by screaming at hospital staff to take the thing away from her. It wasn't an isolated outburst. As a baby and toddler, Mary suffered a pattern of household accidents that her extended family came to believe were not accidents at all. On one occasion, Betty reportedly dropped her from a first-floor window. On another, she gave her daughter a dangerous quantity of sleeping pills. Family members later described believing Betty may have been trying to kill her. According to Bell's own later account, given decades afterward through Sereni, the abuse extended further still. She alleged that her mother, who specialized in sadomasochism as part of her sex work, brought her into contact with clients sexually from as young as 5 years old. These specific allegations have never been independently corroborated beyond Bell's own testimony and family accounts relayed to Sereni, and remain, understandably, some of the most difficult and disputed details of the entire case. What isn't disputed is the broader picture: a childhood defined by neglect, instability, and violence so severe that when psychiatrists later examined Mary, several concluded her environment alone was almost sufficient to explain what she became. By 10 years old, Mary was already known locally for troubling behavior, violent enough with other children that she'd reportedly tried to strangle another young girl before her actual killings began, though this incident, like several details from her early childhood, drew no serious intervention at the time. On May 25, 1968, Mary, along with her 13-year-old neighbor and frequent companion Norma Bell, no relation, lured 4-year-old Martin Brown into an abandoned house in the neighborhood. He was found dead there. The post-mortem examination initially struggled to establish a clear cause of death. There were no obvious ligature marks of the kind investigators would expect from strangulation, and for a period, his death was tentatively classified as accidental. 2 days later, that classification became impossible to sustain. A nearby nursery school on Woodlands Crescent was broken into and ransacked overnight. Supplies scattered, cleaning products spilled across the floor. Among the chaos, investigators found several handwritten notes, crudely spelled in a child's handwriting, directly claiming responsibility for Martin Brown's death. One read, roughly, "We did murder Martin Brown." Another read, "I murder so that I may come back." At the time, police didn't yet connect the vandalism and the notes to a credible ongoing threat. That changed completely on July 31st. 3-year-old Brian Howe was last seen playing in the street outside his home with his siblings, the family dog, and Mary and Norma. When he failed to return home that afternoon, a search began, drawing in neighbors and relatives. Mary herself reportedly helped in the search for the boy she had already killed. At 11:10 that night, Brian's body was found wedged between 2 large concrete blocks on a patch of wasteland locals called the Tin Lizzie, thinly covered with grass and weeds in what one responding officer described as a deliberate but feeble attempt at concealment. His lips showed cyanosis. His neck bore bruising and scratch marks consistent with manual strangulation. 6 small puncture wounds were found on his legs, inflicted after death, and a letter had been carved into his stomach. Investigators would later determine both girls had returned to the body shortly after the killing, with Norma lightly carving an N into it, which Mary then amended into an M, using a broken pair of scissors and a razor blade, also using the blade to cut off some of his hair. The scissors lay near his feet. 2 days before Brian's funeral, Mary reportedly knocked on his family's door, asking to come in and play with him, before coldly informing his mother that she already knew he was dead, and that she wanted to see him in his coffin. Investigators began systematically interviewing every child in the neighborhood who might have seen something. Mary and Norma were vague and inconsistent about their movements on the day Brian disappeared, and under further questioning, Mary began recalling details she hadn't previously mentioned, details that increasingly implicated her directly. A forensic examination of both girls' clothing found gray woolen fibers on Brian's body that matched a dress belonging to Mary precisely, and maroon fibers on his shoes that matched a skirt belonging to Norma, and critically, the same gray fibers from Mary's dress were also found on Martin Brown's body from 2 months earlier, forensically linking her to both killings. What ultimately confirmed the case for Detective Chief Inspector James Dobson was a small, carefully withheld detail. Only investigators knew about the broken scissors found beside Brian's body. Mary mentioned them anyway, unprompted, in one of her statements, information she could only have had if she had been at the scene. Dobson had already, independently, reached his own grim certainty about her. He would later recall standing outside the Howe family home as Brian's coffin was carried out for the funeral procession, watching Mary stand nearby, laughing, rubbing her hands together. "I thought," he said afterward, "my God, I've got to bring her in. She'll do another one." When formally charged with Brian Howe's murder, Mary reportedly responded simply, "That's all right with me." Norma, charged alongside her, reacted very differently, angry, declaring she'd pay back the detective for the accusation. The trial began at Newcastle Assizes in December of 1968. In an unusual decision that drew strong objections from both defense teams, the judge waived the girls' right to anonymity given their age, allowing newspapers to publish their names, ages, and photographs throughout the proceedings, an approach that stood in stark contrast to how juvenile defendants would typically be shielded from public identification. Detectives who worked the interrogations were reportedly unsettled by how sharp Mary's mind was throughout questioning. She would answer one question and, according to accounts of the interviews, correctly anticipate an entire chain of follow-up questions, preparing answers for each in advance. In court, the contrast between the two girls became a central feature of the trial. Norma was widely described as a slow, overwhelmed child, clearly dominated by her more calculating companion. Mary, by contrast, maintained a sharp, composed presence throughout, reportedly offering witty, confident responses to the barristers questioning her, in a manner observers found deeply unsettling given the subject matter. Psychiatrist Dr. Robert Orton testified that Mary showed clear signs of what he diagnosed as a psychopathic personality disorder, marked by a documented lack of feeling toward others and a strong tendency to act on impulse. After deliberating for under 4 hours, the jury acquitted Norma entirely, on the basis that she'd been led into events by Mary rather than acting as an equal participant. Mary herself was cleared of murder, but convicted of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, a verdict available under British law when a defendant's mental functioning is found to be substantially impaired by a recognized condition. She was sentenced to indefinite detention. She would go on to spend 12 years across a series of institutions, including a period at Red Bank-approved school and later Style Prison, briefly escaping with another inmate in 1977 before being recaptured within days. She was released in May of 1980 at 23 years old and was granted a new legal identity, along with lifelong anonymity, a protection later extended to cover her own daughter, born in 1984, after journalists began attempting to track down Belle's new identity in the years following her release. That anonymity became a subject of intense controversy in 1998, when Belle collaborated directly with Gitta Sereny on a biography, Cries Unheard, providing extensive interviews detailing her account of the abuse she said she'd suffered as a child. It later emerged that Belle had been paid for her cooperation. Reports at the time cited a figure around £50,000, though the exact sum was never officially confirmed. The revelation triggered public outrage severe enough that Tony Blair's government explored legal avenues to block the book's publication entirely, on the principle that a convicted killer shouldn't be permitted to profit from recounting her own crimes. Those efforts ultimately failed, and the book was published as planned. Mary Bell's case remains one of the most extensively studied instances of extreme childhood violence in modern criminological history, not simply because of what she did, but because of how unusually well documented the abuse behind it became, decades later, through her own words. It offers, perhaps more directly than any other case on this list, a documented childhood horrific enough that many who've studied it walk away convinced it explains everything. And yet the specific, calculated nature of her killings, luring each victim in with the same practiced lie about a sore throat before strangling them, continues to leave researchers divided over whether even an environment this severe can fully account for what she became. The next case shares an unsettling thread with Bell's. A killer who came terrifyingly close to succeeding in a second, far larger act of violence, stopped only because of a single overlooked detail in his own planning. Southwood Middle School sits in Palmetto Bay, an affluent, artistically focused district just outside Miami. The kind of school where a straight-A student who played the violin and excelled at academics would have seemed, to any outside observer, perfectly unremarkable among his peers. That description fit 14-year-old Jaime Goff exactly. It also, in its own way, fit his best friend and killer, 14-year-old Michael Hernandez. What almost no one around either boy knew was that Hernandez had spent a considerable amount of time developing a private fascination that had nothing to do with school. He had been studying mass, spree, and serial killers online, compiling material into a personal journal that eventually stretched across dozens of pages, internet printouts about notorious murderers, drawings, a scrawled list of people he intended to kill that reportedly included, among others, his own sister. Investigators would later find instructions for building a bomb tucked among the pages, alongside imagery invoking white nationalist ideology entirely disconnected from anything in his actual daily life. According to his own later statements, at least some of this material was performative, cultivated in part to impress a pen pal he was corresponding with, who described herself as a crime enthusiast. But other entries left considerably less room for that explanation, including a direct, unambiguous line: he intended to become a serial killer. The plan very nearly claimed 2 victims instead of 1. On February 2, 2004, the day before Jaime's murder, Hernandez attempted to lure a different close friend, 13-year-old Andre Martin, into the same second-floor bathroom at Southwood, with the specific intention, by his own later confession to detectives, of killing him exactly the way he would go on to kill Jaime the following day, stabbing him in the back. Martin balked at entering the stall Hernandez directed him toward. The bell rang. All 3 boys, Hernandez, Martin, and Jaime, went to class, as though nothing had happened. The next morning, February 3rd, Hernandez lured Jaime into the same bathroom stall with a promise to show him something. Once inside, he pulled out a knife and stabbed Jamie more than 40 times, then slit his throat. He hid the knife in a concealed compartment he had built into his own backpack and walked calmly to his next class. The school was placed on immediate lockdown once Jaime's body was discovered, with students held in their classrooms for most of the day while anxious parents gathered outside, uncertain what had happened. A teacher noticed blood on Hernandez and alerted authorities, who pulled him out of class for questioning. A search of his backpack turned up a bloodied jacket, a latex glove, and the serrated folding knife that would prove to be the murder weapon. After being read his rights and confirming he understood them, Hernandez was questioned for several hours before confessing fully, waiving his right to have the case heard in juvenile court. In that confession, when a detective asked directly what his intentions had been the day before with Andre Martin, Hernandez answered without hesitation. His plan had been to kill Martin the same way he'd just killed Jaime, Except, in Martin's case, he'd intended to stab him in the back instead. And that would have been it, he told the detective, describing the plan with a clinical simplicity that unsettled investigators use to far more emotional confessions from young offenders. A defense psychiatrist who later evaluated him, Dr. Stephen Hoagie, testified that Hernandez had specifically chosen both Jaime and Martin as victims because they were the two people who knew he intended to eventually kill others once he turned 18, suggesting the murder wasn't simply the fulfillment of a private fantasy, but a calculated act to eliminate witnesses to a much longer-term plan he'd already shared, in some form, with people close to him. Because of the severity of the charges, Hernandez was charged as an adult with first-degree murder and attempted first-degree murder, tried in criminal court rather than juvenile court under Florida's direct file statute, which grants prosecutors discretion to bypass the juvenile system entirely for cases of this magnitude. At his 2008 trial, his defense argued he had been legally insane at the time of the killing. The jury rejected that claim and convicted him of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, along with a consecutive 30-year term for the attempted murder of Andre Martin. That sentence was later reopened following a landmark 2012 U.S. Supreme Court ruling that found mandatory life without parole sentences unconstitutional for juvenile offenders, a decision subsequently made retroactive to older cases like his. At his 2016 resentencing hearing, prosecutor Gail Levine argued that Hernandez remained, in her words, exactly the same well-planned, well-thought-out killer he had been at 14. Court psychologist Dr. Rick Suarez, who evaluated him for the hearing, quoted directly from Hernandez's own journal, including a chillingly procedural note reading, in part, "Make sure they're dead, make sure no one else is in the bathroom, and if so, kill them too." Prison records introduced at the same hearing showed Hernandez had been disciplined behind bars for possessing homemade knives and a pipe. Andre Martin, the boy whose refusal to enter that bathroom stall had spared his own life 12 years earlier, and who had since become a Miami-Dade County police detective, testified that he believed the life sentence was entirely fitting. Hernandez was resentenced to life in prison, with eligibility for parole after 25 years. He never reached that eligibility. In April of 2021, at 31 years old, he collapsed and died in custody at Columbia Correctional Institution in Florida. An autopsy later attributed his death to cardiac dysrhythmia linked to morbid obesity, natural causes, with no indication of foul play. Jaime's father, Jorge Goff, told reporters he and his wife still spoke frequently about the son they had lost, 17 years after his death, and said he was shocked to learn that Hernandez had died before ever facing the possibility of release. What makes Hernandez's case especially chilling to the investigators and criminologists who've studied it isn't the murder itself, it's the clarity of the intent behind it, and the fact that it so nearly claimed 2 victims in as many days rather than 1. Unlike many names on this list, Hernandez wasn't reacting to an unstable home environment or acting on sudden impulse. According to his own documented journal and his own confession, he had methodically built an actual plan to become exactly what he ultimately did become, cut short only because one intended victim, on one ordinary Monday morning, simply chose not to walk into a bathroom stall. From a quiet betrayal inside a school hallway, the next case takes us to South America, and to a 15-year-old whose double life as both a student and the leader of an armed teenage gang ended in a violent shootout that made national headlines. Quito, Ecuador, in the early 1990s, was a city where a 15-year-old could roam largely unsupervised, and Juan Fernando Hermosa Suarez did exactly that. Born in Los Rios province in 1976, He was adopted as an infant and raised in a crowded neighborhood north of the capital. His adoptive mother, deaf and suffering from arthritis, largely looked after him alone, while his adoptive father spent much of his time away, managing properties in a distant province. By 15, Hermosa had assembled a loose gang of roughly 10 other teenagers, frequenting video game arcades in the city's La Marine district and nightclubs and bars near the Central University. A double life that, to most adults around him, likely looked like ordinary, if slightly reckless, teenage rebellion. That changed on November 22, 1991. Leaving a nightclub with friends, the group hailed a taxi. Partway through the ride, Hermosa drew a 9mm pistol and shot the driver dead. It was the first of what would become 22 murders across roughly 4 months. Among Hermosa's own later claims, the first killings targeted taxi drivers specifically, using the routine trust of hailing a cab as a way to get close to victims before turning the gun on them once the ride was underway. According to several accounts of the case, Hermosa also began targeting gay men in the city during this same period, following an evening at a beauty salon where the gang had grown friendly with its openly gay proprietor. What began as a social evening reportedly ended in an argument, and Hermosa shot the man dead in his own home. Over the following weeks, that pattern repeated. Men targeted in the city's gay community became a recurring category of victim alongside the taxi drivers, ultimately accounting for roughly half of his 22 total killings, along with a truck driver and his assistant, a police officer, and several other victims caught up in the same escalating spree. The killings, concentrated heavily on weekends, created a genuine climate of panic across northern Quito. Taxi drivers grew afraid to pick up young male passengers at night, and members of the local gay community, already navigating a hostile social climate, found themselves targeted by an unknown assailant with no discernible pattern investigators could immediately trace. The city's mayor placed a specialized National Police Intervention Unit in charge of the investigation. The break in the case came almost by accident. Police apprehended a group of young men attempting an unrelated robbery in the city center, and during questioning, those detainees identified Hermosa as the suspect responsible for the string of killings gripping the city. Officers traced him to a residence at the intersection of America and Diguja Streets, and in the early hours of January 16, 1992, entered the home through a skylight positioned above what they determined was his bedroom. He was captured, according to the most consistently corroborated accounts, while asleep. What followed startled the 10-agent unit that transferred him to Garcia Moreno prison that same morning. The suspected killer behind 22 murders was, by his own words upon arrival, still a minor. "I want to make it clear," he reportedly told those present, "that my name is Juan Fernando Hermosa Suarez, and that on February 28th, I will be 16 years old." In his own account of the killings, Hermosa insisted he had never intended to kill anyone, that he had told each victim to stay quiet and nothing would happen to them, and that it was only when they ignored that warning, in his telling, that the situation turned fatal. He described specific instances of victims allegedly threatening him first, including one man with a revolver and a taxi driver who supposedly attacked him with a wheel wrench, framing at least some of the killings as self-defense against people who wouldn't cooperate with his robberies. Because Ecuadorian law at the time capped criminal sentences for minors at 4 years, regardless of the severity or number of offenses, Hermosa was sentenced in November of 1993 to the maximum penalty available, 4 years, to be served at the Virgilio Guerrero Rehabilitation Center, a facility built for juveniles but reportedly plagued by inadequate oversight and limited actual rehabilitation programming. The sentence, given the scale of what he'd done, provoked intense public and media scrutiny, with Ecuadorian newspapers branding him both El Niño del Terror and, in some coverage, the nation's #1 enemy, fueling a debate about the adequacy of the country's juvenile justice system that persists in Ecuador today. His time in custody wasn't uneventful. In 1993, Hermosa escaped the facility, an escape that, according to several accounts, involved killing a police officer or guard in the process. He fled across the border into Colombia, where he was eventually recaptured and returned to Ecuador to complete his original sentence. He was ultimately released in January of 1996, at 19 years old, having served his full term despite the escape. He did not survive long as a free man. On February 28, 1996, his 20th birthday, the same date he had once told arresting officers he was counting down to as a minor, Hermosa was found dead, in circumstances widely understood at the time to be a targeted act of retribution, though the identities of those responsible were never conclusively established. He had been free for barely a month. Hermosa's case remains a significant and still debated reference point in Ecuadorian criminal history, cited specifically as the youngest known serial killer the country has ever recorded. Unlike several other names on this list, his story didn't end with any form of rehabilitation, extended incarceration, or peaceful reintegration. It ended with a legal system that, bound by its own age-based sentencing caps, released a confessed murderer of 22 people after just 4 years, only for him to be killed himself within weeks of stepping back into the world he'd once terrorized. The next case takes us back to the American justice system itself, and to a killer whose age forced prosecutors to confront a legal question that had never before been fully settled. Christian Fernandez's life, long before March of 2011, reads like a documented case study in cascading childhood trauma. He was born in Miami in 1999 to a 12-year-old mother, Bianella Susana, herself the victim of a sexual assault by his 25-year-old father, a crime for which the father ultimately received only probation. At 2 years old, Christian was found wandering naked and filthy on a South Florida street at 4 in the morning, after the grandmother caring for him had holed up using drugs in a nearby motel room. Both he and his teenage mother were placed into foster care together shortly afterward. By age 8, the Florida Department of Children and Families was investigating a report that an older cousin had sexually molested him, alongside other troubling incidents reported around the same time, behavior including harming a kitten and disturbing sexualized conduct at school. Just months before his 12th birthday, his stepfather shot and killed himself in front of the family, rather than face arrest on child abuse charges, which was what ultimately prompted the family's move from Miami to Jacksonville. That's the context in which, in March of 2011, 12-year-old Christian was left alone caring for his 2-year-old half-brother, David Galarraga, at their apartment on Alden Road. Something happened in that apartment that ended with David suffering catastrophic head trauma. Prosecutors alleged Christian struck the toddler's head and face against a bookshelf more than a dozen times, hard enough that David lost consciousness. His mother, home at the time along with 2 other half-siblings, waited more than 6 hours before finally taking David to the hospital. He died there 2 days later from blunt force trauma to the head. What followed made Christian Fernandez the youngest person ever indicted on a first-degree murder charge in Jacksonville's history. State Attorney Angela Corey made the decision to charge him as an adult, a choice that triggered immediate, sustained public opposition. Petition drives, protests, and national media attention questioning whether any 12-year-old could be legitimately held to that standard. Corey defended the decision publicly, arguing that Fernandez needed both punishment and a level of rehabilitation the juvenile system alone couldn't provide. The case grew more complicated as it proceeded. Prosecutors also charged Fernandez separately with sexual battery against a different 5-year-old half-brother. But in August of 2012, Judge Mallory Cooper made a pivotal ruling. She suppressed the videotaped police interrogation and confession Fernandez had given detectives, finding that a 12-year-old with no understanding of the legal system could not have knowingly and intelligently waived his Miranda rights. In her written ruling, Cooper specifically cited a moment near the end of the interview where Fernandez, after signing away those rights, asked the detective questioning him whether the document was just between you and me, a question the judge said made clear he hadn't actually understood what he'd agreed to. The sexual battery charge was ultimately dropped as well, following the suppression ruling and conflicting statements from the young victim. The case grew still more complicated that same year when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life without parole sentences for juvenile offenders were unconstitutional, a ruling that left Fernandez's own defense attorneys unable to even advise him what sentence he might realistically be facing, since Florida's state law hadn't yet caught up to the new federal precedent. By this point, Fernandez's defense had been taken over by a team of prominent Jacksonville attorneys working largely pro bono, including Hank Cox and Melissa Nelson, the same Melissa Nelson who would go on to challenge Angela Corey in the next state attorney election and win, in a race where Corey's decision to charge Fernandez as an adult became a defining, hot-button issue. In February of 2013, less than a month before his scheduled murder trial, 14-year-old Fernandez pleaded guilty to significantly reduced charges, manslaughter and aggravated battery, while being permitted, unusually, to plead as a juvenile despite having been charged as an adult. He was ordered to remain in juvenile detention until his 19th birthday, after which he would face 8 years of probation. Violating that probation would mean facing up to 15 years in adult state prison. His mother, Bianella Susanna, separately pleaded guilty to aggravated manslaughter for the delay in seeking medical help for David, receiving a sentence that credited her time served and suspended the remainder to probation. Fernandez was released in January of 2018, the day after his 19th birthday, having spent nearly 7 years in custody since his original arrest at 12 years old. As of recent years, both Fernandez and his mother were reported still living in Jacksonville. Fernandez's case is included here less because it fits the traditional profile of a serial killer, and more because of how directly it forced the American legal system to confront the outer limits of applying adult criminal standards to a child not yet even a teenager, a child whose own documented history of abuse and neglect stretched back, essentially, to infancy. Unlike most cases on this list, there was no confirmed pattern of repeated, separate killings. But the case remains one of the most frequently cited examples of just how young a person can be while still facing the full, unmitigated weight of adult criminal prosecution, and how difficult it can be, even for the professionals directly involved, to determine where accountability ends and a childhood of accumulated trauma begins. The next case returns to England, to a teenager who didn't simply commit violence. He announced, in advance, and to anyone who would listen, exactly what he intended to become. Colchester, Essex, is an unremarkable English town, the kind of place where a park bench, a nature trail, and a quiet residential estate wouldn't normally register as anything other than backdrop. In 2014, all three became crime scenes in a case that would leave the town paying an estimated £2.6 million on investigation and public reassurance measures, and handing out roughly 3,000 personal safety alarms to residents too frightened to walk outside alone. James Fairweather grew up in Colchester, struggling considerably. Bullied at school for his prominent ears, held back by undiagnosed dyslexia that wouldn't be identified until years later, after his arrest. He was hit hard by his grandmother's death in 2012. By early 2014, 15 years old, he'd already accumulated 2 prior convictions: criminal damage for breaking a house window, and a knife-point robbery in which he'd threatened a shopkeeper for cash, a lighter, and a pack of cigars, resulting in a referral order and a year of supervision. 3 days after receiving that supervision order, Fairweather carried out his first murder. On the morning of March 29, 2014, 33-year-old James Atfield, a father of 5 known locally as Jim, who had suffered a brain injury in a car accident years earlier that had weakened one side of his body and affected his speech, was found on the grass in Colchester's Castle Park, having been stabbed a staggering 102 times. He'd been lying there after drinking, effectively defenseless, when Fairweather attacked him. Atfield had defensive wounds on his arms and hands, suggesting he remained conscious enough to try fighting back, despite the sheer number of wounds. He died from blood loss before paramedics could save him. The violence was severe enough that police described some details as too gruesome for public release. In his eventual confession, Fairweather told detectives that voices in his head had selected Atfield as his target while the man lay sleeping on the grass, and that those same voices began laughing as he repeatedly stabbed him. It was him, lying there on the grass, he reportedly told police. He was fast asleep and you would swear he was drunk. 3 months later, on June 17th, Fairweather armed himself with a 15-inch bayonet and spent roughly 2 hours touring the same residential estate, searching specifically for someone alone and vulnerable. He found 31-year-old Nahid Al-Manea, a Saudi student at the University of Essex, who had arrived in the UK only 6 months earlier, walking alone along the Salary Brook Trail toward campus, dressed, notably, in modest clothing consistent with her Islamic faith, which briefly led investigators to consider whether the attack had been religiously motivated, before it became clear both victims had been selected at random. He approached from behind, stabbed her in the back, spun her around, and deliberately knocked off her sunglasses before driving the knife through one eye, and then, once she'd fallen, straddled her and stabbed the other eye as well, before inflicting more than a dozen additional wounds. She died from the combined damage to her brain and internal organs. The randomness connecting 2 apparently unrelated victims, killed at different times of day, with no personal connection between them, initially led investigators to consider whether they were looking for 2 separate killers entirely. The uncertainty was serious enough that when premature assumptions briefly framed Al-Manea's killing as a possible hate crime, Easel threatened retaliatory attacks against Colchester using a dedicated hashtag, based on nothing more than unconfirmed speculation about motive. Fairweather didn't attempt another attack for almost a year afterward. The public, by then thoroughly on edge, had grown wary enough that opportunities for an isolated, vulnerable target had become scarce. On the morning of May 27, 2015, a dog walker named Michelle Sadler noticed a teenage boy loitering near the Salary Brook Trail, staring at her from close range with what she later described as a manic look she said she'd never forget. She called police. When officers searched him, they found him wearing rubber-gripped gloves and carrying a lock knife. He was arrested, initially, only for weapon possession. That evening, under further questioning, Fairweather confessed to both murders unprompted. "I've been hearing voices which are telling me to murder people," he told detectives, "and I've murdered 2 people." He also admitted that at the moment of his arrest, he had been actively searching for a 3rd victim. A psychiatrist who evaluated him in August of 2015 later described some of what Fairweather told her as among the most disturbing antisocial and violent material she had encountered professionally, including claims that voices instructed him to harm infants and mutilate sex workers. Investigators searching his belongings found an extensive collection of documentaries about serial killers, including detailed material on Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper. At trial, the prosecution's own psychiatric witness testified that Fairweather's claimed hallucinations appeared to be fabricated specifically to support an insanity defense, rather than genuine psychotic symptoms. Fairweather pleaded not guilty to murder, but admitted to manslaughter by diminished responsibility, a plea the Crown Prosecution Service refused to accept, pushing the case to a full murder trial instead. After a 10-day trial and roughly 8.5 hours of deliberation, a jury found him unanimously guilty of both murders in April of 2016. At sentencing, Justice Robin Spencer delivered a scathing assessment, describing Fairweather as having acted out violent, sadistic fantasies fueled by a months-long obsession with serial killers, and specifically noting he appeared to be emulating Peter Sutcliffe, pointing to Fairweather's deliberate targeting of Almanea's eyes as a direct echo of one of Sutcliffe's own signature methods. The judge noted that superficial, controlled wounds found on both victims contradicted Fairweather's claim of having acted purely in an uncontrolled rage. Separately from the formal evidence, the judge revealed that Fairweather had told doctors he wanted to kill 15 more people before he was ultimately caught. Spencer also addressed Fairweather's undiagnosed autism directly, stating firmly that it was not a defense and cautioning against the unfair and unjustified slur of suggesting autism predisposes anyone toward violence. Fairweather was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 27 years. James Atfield's mother, Julie Finch, told the court she had been unable to work and had lost her home in the aftermath of her son's murder, and described Fairweather afterward as a monster who had shown no mercy toward a man who had already survived so much. Nahid Almanea's brother, Raed, said in a statement that his family's grief remained crippling, and that his father still couldn't understand why his sister had been chosen at all. Fairweather's case is frequently discussed alongside Michael Hernandez's for a strikingly similar reason. Both demonstrated clear, documented intent to kill well beyond their initial victims, suggesting that the murders ultimately stopped represented only a fraction of what each intended to carry out in full. The next case moves backward nearly a century and a half to one of the earliest documented cases in American history, a name still cited by historians today as the country's first confirmed juvenile serial killer. Charlestown, Massachusetts, in 1859, is where Jesse Harding Pomeroy was born, the second son of an alcoholic, abusive dockyard worker and a seamstress mother who would remain, throughout his life, the one person who consistently believed something could be done to help him. As an infant, Pomeroy suffered a serious illness that left him with a permanently deformed right eye, clouded over with a whitish film, giving him a distinctive and unsettling appearance that other children seized on immediately. He was bullied relentlessly for it. His father beat him regularly and severely, at times stripping him naked to do so. Pomeroy grew into a solitary child, prone to severe headaches, dizzy spells, and epileptic-like episodes, spending much of his free time reading violent stories about frontier warfare and reenacting torture methods from those stories during play with other children. The earliest documented warning sign came with a pair of lovebirds his mother had purchased. Pomeroy was later found to have twisted both their heads off. His mother, believing his difficulties stemmed entirely from the bullying he endured, interpreted even this as a symptom of his unhappiness rather than a sign of anything more serious. Beginning in December of 1871, when Pomeroy was just 12 years old, children in Chelsea and later South Boston began turning up beaten, stripped, and bound, tied to fence posts, hung by their wrists from beams inside abandoned outhouses, whipped severely enough to leave lasting welts. The first documented victim, 4-year-old Billy Payne, was found hanging half-naked from a privy roof beam on Powderhorn Hill, his back covered in whip marks. Over the following 9 months, at least 8 more children, none older than 10, were subjected to similar attacks, restrained, beaten with sticks or rope, some sexually assaulted. Pomeroy would befriend his victims first, luring them with money or treats to isolated locations before the violence began. Local newspapers, tracking the mounting pattern with increasing alarm, began referring to the culprit as the boy torturer and the Red Devil. He was finally identified in September of 1872, when a witness at a South Boston police station recognized him peering through a window and alerted officers inside. Confronted, 12-year-old Pomeroy readily admitted to being the boy torturer, and the remaining victims from throughout the year confirmed him as their attacker. He was arraigned before a juvenile court judge, confessed fully, and was sentenced to 6 years at the State Reform School in Westboro. He served less than a year and a half of that sentence. Described by staff as a model inmate, cooperative, academically engaged, even willing to inform on fellow inmates, and helped along by his mother's persistent lobbying for his release, Pomeroy was paroled back into her custody in February of 1874, not yet 15 years old. He'd been free barely a month when, on March 18th, 10-year-old Katie Curran walked into the small dressmaking shop Pomeroy's mother ran, asking whether they carried notebooks for school. Pomeroy told her to come down to the cellar to check the stock. There, out of anyone's sight, he killed her. Investigators would later determine the attack included assault beyond the killing itself, after which he concealed her body beneath a pile of ashes near a water closet in the basement, washed himself, and returned to work as though nothing had happened. When Curran's disappearance triggered neighborhood suspicion, everyone locally knew Pomeroy's history. Police went so far as to reassure her worried mother directly that Jesse couldn't possibly be involved, since he was, in the department's own words, believed fully rehabilitated and had in any case only ever been known to target young boys. Just over a month later, on April 22nd, 4-year-old Horace Millen disappeared from South Boston. The following day, 2 brothers searching a nearby beach for clams instead found his body in a shallow pit, severely mutilated, with injuries investigators described as almost unbearable to catalog even by the standards of the era's crime reporting. Detective Captain Savage, upon learning that Pomeroy was out on parole, ordered his immediate arrest. Footprints found near the body were cast in plaster and matched precisely to the soles of Pomeroy's own boots. When questioned, he initially refused to confess, even when confronted directly with the physical evidence against him. It was only when police took him to view Millen's body in person that he broke down, admitting he had killed him, telling officers he was sorry, that something had made him do it, and asking them directly, "Put me somewhere so I can't do such things." The case against him deepened further once his mother's shop changed hands. Forced to close her business amid the mounting scandal and public backlash, Ruth Pomeroy sold the building. The new tenants, beginning renovations, encountered an overpowering smell coming from the basement. Workmen discovered Katie Curran's decomposing remains hidden beneath the ash heap where Pomeroy had left her 5 weeks earlier. Both his mother and older brother were briefly arrested as suspected accomplices. a development that appears to have pushed Pomeroy to confess to Curran's murder as well. By his later account, specifically to clear his family's names, though he would go on to recant elements of both confessions at different points before trial. His trial for Horace Millen's murder began in December of 1874 and captivated the entire nation, not simply Boston, a case that forced the country to confront, for what was widely considered the first time in its legal history, the question of whether a child could be criminally sane enough to be executed for a killing this brutal. His defense argued a form of what 19th century psychiatry termed moral insanity, that Pomeroy was driven by some irresistible internal compulsion beyond his conscious control, pointing to his own repeated statements that something made him do it, as evidence of genuine mental disease rather than deliberate criminal intent. The prosecution countered forcefully, with the state's attorney general arguing in his closing that Pomeroy had displayed, throughout his crimes, unusual talent and shrewdness, behavior he characterized not as insanity, but as calculated depravity. The jury sided with the prosecution. Pomeroy was found guilty of first-degree murder, becoming the youngest person in Massachusetts history ever convicted at that level, a distinction that has technically stood for a century and a half since. He was sentenced to death by hanging, the only penalty available under the charge at the time. What followed was an extended, highly public standoff between the courts and the state's political leadership over whether a boy this young should actually be executed. Two successive Massachusetts governors, in turn, refused to sign his death warrant, and his sentence was ultimately commuted to life in solitary confinement, a punishment considered severe even by that era's standards, and one Pomeroy would go on to endure for an extraordinary 41 consecutive years, broken only by monthly visits from his mother until her own death. He attempted escape from custody at least 3 times during his early imprisonment, according to jail logbooks documenting the attempts. In 1917, more than 4 decades into his sentence, Pomeroy was finally permitted to rejoin the general prison population. He died in custody in 1932 at 72 years old, having spent 58 years incarcerated in total, one of the longest prison terms ever recorded in American history for a crime committed as a juvenile, and a solitary confinement stretch second in documented length, only to Robert Stroud, the so-called Birdman of Alcatraz. Pomeroy's case remains foundational to the modern understanding of juvenile violence in the United States, cited specifically because his early pattern, non-fatal torture escalating directly to murder following a period of premature release, closely mirrors a pattern investigators would go on to recognize in several other cases on this very list, more than a century later. The next case moves to Canada, and to a betrayal far more calculated than anything discussed so far. A family destroyed not by a stranger, but from within its own walls. Medicine Hat, Alberta, is a city of roughly 60,000 people, the kind of tight-knit community where a triple murder doesn't just make local news, it reshapes how the entire city sees itself for years afterward. Until early 2006, Jasmine Richardson was, by every account from people who knew her, a happy, social, well-liked kid. A good student with no history of trouble, raised by parents, Mark and Deborah Richardson, who had both been recovering drug addicts, having met at a gym in Sudbury, Ontario, and rebuilt a stable, loving household together in the years since. That began to change once Jasmine immersed herself in goth subculture and social media, drifting toward increasingly dark online communities. In January of 2006, a mutual friend introduced her to 23-year-old Jeremy Steinke, who claimed to those around him to be a 300-year-old werewolf, wore a small vial of blood around his neck, and had made disturbing posts online about violent fantasies well before he ever met her. Steinke, by his own account, wasn't fully aware of Jasmine's actual age at first, though people close to him would later tell investigators they'd repeatedly warned him the relationship was grossly inappropriate given the 11-year age gap. Jasmine and Steinke grew close quickly, corresponding constantly online and meeting in secret once her parents began restricting the relationship. Mark and Deborah, understandably alarmed by their 12-year-old daughter dating a 23-year-old man, grounded her repeatedly, confiscated her devices, and did everything within a parent's normal authority to end it. It didn't work. Jasmine continued sneaking out to see him, and according to accounts from her friends, began openly talking about wanting to run away from home entirely rather than continue living under her parents' rules. Her resentment reportedly extended to her own 8-year-old brother Jacob as well. According to Steinke's later account, he witnessed Jasmine strangling the boy on one occasion, and she had expressed embarrassment at having to bring him along whenever she went out. Jacob had reportedly confided in a family friend that he was afraid of his older sister. The breaking point, by Jasmine's own later account, came after she was caught sneaking away from a concert to be with Steinke and was subsequently grounded and had her electronics taken away again. She began fantasizing, in her own words, about being permanently rid of her parents. In online messages later recovered by investigators, she wrote to Steinke describing a plan. It began with her killing her parents and ended with her finally living with him. Steinke responded enthusiastically, telling her he loved the plan but that they'd need to work out the details together. In a separate post on his own blog just weeks before the murders, Steinke wrote openly about wanting to slit her parents' throats, framing their disapproval as something that would ultimately be paid for in blood. On the night of April 22nd into the early hours of April 23, 2006, the two put their plan into action. Steinke entered the Richardson home and attacked Mark Richardson first. When Deborah came downstairs to investigate the commotion, she was killed as well. According to the most consistently corroborated accounts, Jasmine was responsible for her younger brother, stabbing Jacob multiple times while he slept in his own bed. The three victims suffered more than 70 stab wounds between them, according to later trial evidence. Earlier that same evening, Steinke had reportedly watched the film Natural Born Killers with friends, telling them afterward that he and his young girlfriend intended to do something similar to her entire family. After the killings, the pair fled the scene together, spending the night at a friend's house, where witnesses described them as behaving strangely lightheartedly, as though nothing unusual had happened. The following day, one of Jacob's young friends arrived at the Richardson home for a scheduled play date and discovered the bodies, alerting his own mother, who called police. For a brief, tense period, investigators feared Jasmine herself might be an additional victim, possibly abducted along with whatever had happened to her family. That fear ended the next day, when she was located roughly 130 kilometers away in Leader, Saskatchewan, together with Steinke. A crucial piece of evidence had already pointed investigators directly at her: a stick figure drawing depicting her own family being murdered, discovered inside her school locker. Both were charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Because Canadian law prohibits trying anyone under 14 as an adult regardless of the severity of the crime, Jasmine, 12 at the time of the killings, 13 by the time she was convicted, was tried under the Youth Criminal Justice Act. She pleaded not guilty, telling the court she and Steinke had only had hypothetical conversations about killing her family, and that she never actually intended to go through with it. A jury disagreed, convicting her on all 3 counts. She was sentenced to the maximum penalty available to an offender her age, 10 years, structured as an initial period in a psychiatric facility followed by years of increasingly independent community supervision, becoming the youngest person in Canadian history ever convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder. Steinke, tried separately as an adult, was convicted of all 3 murders as well, with prosecutors successfully arguing that his manipulation and influence over a 12-year-old had been central to the killings, even though the physical evidence indicated Jasmine herself had directly killed her own brother. He received 3 concurrent life sentences with no possibility of parole for 25 years, and has since changed his legal name to Jackson May. Jasmine, identified publicly for years only by the initials JR under Canadian Youth Protection Law, completed her full 10-year sentence in May of 2016. At her final sentence review, the presiding judge, who had overseen her case from the very beginning, stated that she had met every goal of her rehabilitation without exception and was assessed as a low risk to reoffend, telling her directly that he believed her parents and brother would be proud of the person she'd become. Jasmine offered no apology or public expression of remorse during that final hearing. Reaction in Medicine Hat remained sharply divided even a decade later, some residents expressing support for a second chance given her age at the time of the crime, others voicing lasting anger that her sentence, given what she'd done, had come to an end at all. One of the first police officers to arrive at the murder scene in 2006, later an inspector with the Medicine Hat Police Service, said publicly that his greatest fear was that Jasmine's evident cooperation with the rehabilitation system over the years might reflect a genuine change, or might simply reflect someone who had learned exactly what the system wanted to see. Richardson's case remains one of the starkest Canadian examples of how an external, manipulative relationship can catalyze extreme violence within an otherwise unremarkable household, and how genuinely difficult it can be, even years later, to fully separate a young offender's own culpability from the influence of an adult who deliberately groomed her toward it. The next case returns to Canada as well, but to a killer whose story didn't end with his original conviction, because decades later, on the very first day he was ever allowed outside unsupervised, he proved that nothing about him had truly changed at all. Peter Woodcock, born David Michael Kruger in Peterborough, Ontario in 1939, was given up for adoption by his 17-year-old mother after just a month of breastfeeding him. What followed was a chaotic infancy spent moving between foster homes, none of which he ever managed to bond with. Adoption records from the period describe a baby who cried constantly and struggled to feed. By his first birthday, he had developed an intense fear of anyone approaching him, and his speech consisted of what caregivers described as strange, incoherent, animal-like whining. At least one foster home physically abused him. At 2 years old, he required medical treatment for an injured neck following a beating. At 3, he was placed in a stable, upper-middle-class foster home with Frank and Susan Maynard, who brought him to Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children for extensive treatment over the following years, trying to address the severe emotional damage already visible in him. It didn't fully take. He continued struggling in every social setting throughout his childhood, bullied relentlessly by other children. At 12, he was sent to a live-in school for emotionally disturbed children, where staff documented him acting out aggressively toward other students in explicitly sexual ways. He was eventually discharged and moved through a private school and then a public high school, bullied at both despite being, by his teacher's own accounts, a genuinely bright student who excelled academically. In September of 1956, 17-year-old Woodcock began riding his bicycle through Toronto, approaching young children and offering them rides on his handlebars before leading them to secluded locations. On September 15th, he lured 7-year-old Wayne Millette away from the Exhibition Place grounds, sexually molested him, and strangled him to death. Millette's body was found the next morning, his clothes removed and then deliberately put back on him, his face pressed into the dirt, bite marks left on his calf and buttock, and pennies scattered near the body in what appeared to be a ritualistic gesture. Toronto police made a catastrophic error in the investigation that followed. They arrested and relentlessly interrogated a different 14-year-old boy, Ron Moffat, extracting a confession, despite witnesses who clearly placed Moffat inside a movie theater both before and after the murder took place. Moffat was convicted and sentenced to youth detention for a crime he hadn't committed, and remained there for months, even after investigators began to suspect a genuine serial predator was still active in the city. That predator struck again on October 6th, luring 9-year-old Gary Morris from Cabbagetown to Cherry Beach, where he strangled and beat the boy to death. The coroner determined Morris had died from a ruptured liver. Then, on January 19, 1957, Woodcock approached 4-year-old Carol Voice, offered her a bicycle ride, and led her under the Bloor Viaduct, where he sexually assaulted and killed her. This time, witnesses saw him cycling away from the scene, and their descriptions allowed police to produce a composite sketch accurate enough that, once published on the front page of the Toronto Star, it led directly to Woodcock's arrest just 2 days later. He confessed fully to all 3 murders. Asked afterward what had gone through his mind at the moment of his arrest, he reportedly said his only fear had been that his mother would find out, and that he hadn't known whether police would let her near him. At his 4-day trial that April, Woodcock was found not criminally responsible by reason of insanity and committed indefinitely to the Oak Ridge Division of Penetanguishene Mental Health Center, a maximum security psychiatric facility, a legal outcome that meant no conventional prison sentence was ever handed down. Ron Moffat, the wrongfully convicted teenager, was finally released once Woodcock's confession made his innocence undeniable. What followed was one of the most ethically troubling chapters in Canadian forensic psychiatry. Diagnosed as a textbook psychopath, Woodcock became a subject in a series of experimental treatments the facility pursued throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s, aimed at curing psychopathy itself, a goal no legitimate treatment has ever actually achieved. He was given LSD, along with scopolamine, sodium amytal, methadone, and other personality-altering drugs. He participated in a program called the Total Encounter Capsule, in which patients were drugged, stripped, and locked in a windowless, continuously lit, soundproof room for days at a stretch, intended to strip away the psychopathic personality and expose some presumed core of goodness underneath. He also went through what became known among inmates as the 100-day Hate-In, extended forced confinement with other diagnosed psychopaths, designed by a Harvard psychologist with a documented background in CIA interrogation research, meant to provoke genuine empathy through relentless mutual confrontation. None of it worked. Woodcock, by every account, remained exactly as dangerous as the day he arrived, and was documented engaging in coercive sexual behavior with fellow patients throughout his confinement. Eventually transferred to less restrictive facilities, as his case was periodically reassessed, Woodcock changed his name to David Michael Kruger and ended up at Brockville Psychiatric Hospital, where he formed a relationship with a fellow patient, Bruce Hamill. Over time, Woodcock convinced Hamill that an alien brotherhood would resolve his problems if he helped kill a different patient at the facility, Dennis Kerr. Hamill, acting on that manipulation, went to a hardware store and purchased a plumber's wrench, a hatchet, knives, and a sleeping bag. then used his own standing privileges to sign Woodcock out on an escorted day pass. Together, on July 13, 1991, they lured Kerr to a secluded location and killed him. Hamill then took a large quantity of over-the-counter sleeping pills, apparently waiting for the promised aliens to arrive. Woodcock walked to a nearby police station and confessed. The killing triggered a formal coroner's inquest and widespread public calls to overhaul how Ontario's forensic psychiatric system evaluated whether patients like Woodcock were safe enough for any degree of release. Not because the system had simply failed to notice a risk, but because Woodcock himself had actively orchestrated the entire plot from inside the facility, using a more vulnerable fellow patient as his instrument. He was returned to Penetanguishene, where he would spend the final 18 years of his life. By then physically frail, nearly blind, and hard of hearing, he reportedly lived a quiet institutional existence, following Toronto news closely and listening to shortwave radio. He died at the facility on March 5, 2010, his 71st birthday, having spent 53 of his 71 years in psychiatric custody. Woodcock's case remains one of the most frequently cited examples of the real limits of rehabilitation for certain violent offenders, not simply because decades of treatment failed to change him, but because those same decades gave him ample time and opportunity to manipulate the system and another vulnerable person into carrying out one more killing on his behalf. From a killer whose true nature resurfaced decades after his original conviction, the next case shifts continents entirely. To a vigilante whose body count, if his own claims are to be believed, would place him among the most prolific killers on this entire list. Pedro Rodriguez Filho's violence began before he was even born. His father, a drunk, abusive man, kicked his pregnant mother in the stomach during one of his frequent assaults on her, an attack severe enough that Pedro entered the world with a fractured skull, leaving a scar on his forehead that remained visible for the rest of his life. He was one of 14 children raised in a clay and straw hut in rural Brazil, in a household where the only place any of the kids felt genuinely safe was outside, away from their father. By his own account, he first felt a real urge to kill at 13, during a fight with an older cousin who'd punched him in the face. Lying on the ground afterward, Pedro reportedly looked up and told his cousin plainly that he was going to kill him, a threat his cousin laughed off, not realizing he meant it literally. At 14, that impulse turned into his first actual killing. His father had been fired from his job as a school security guard after being falsely accused of stealing food from the kitchen. In retaliation, Pedro took his grandfather's shotgun and killed the deputy mayor responsible for his father's dismissal, then killed the security guard he personally suspected of being the real thief. On the run, Pedro fled to the greater São Paulo region, where he began robbing drug dens and killing traffickers, building a reputation in the local press as a kind of vigilante folk figure, earning the nickname Pedrinho Matador, roughly Killer Little Pedro, or in some translations, Killer Petey. He fell into a relationship with a woman named Maria Aparecida Olympia, known as Botinha, effectively stepping into the role her late partner, a local drug lord, had once held, which in turn drew him deeper into gang conflict, killing several rivals along the way. When Botinha, pregnant with his child, was murdered by a rival gang leader, Pedro's killing escalated into open personal revenge. According to multiple accounts, he tracked down and killed members of the gang responsible, in some tellings including a targeted massacre at a gathering organized by the group that had killed her. His personal reckoning didn't stop with strangers. At 20 years old, having learned that his own father had years earlier stabbed his mother 21 times with a machete, Pedro found him and stabbed him 22 times with a fishing knife in return, one more wound than his father had inflicted on his mother, a detail Pedro later described as deliberate. Rumors spread afterward that he had eaten part of his father's heart. In later interviews, he confirmed cutting a piece of it out, but denied actually consuming it, saying he'd chewed and spat it out as a final act of revenge rather than swallowed it. Pedro was finally arrested on May 24, 1973, at 18 years old, cornered in a dramatic gunfight at a bar after being informed on by the father of twins he'd previously targeted. Badly wounded, he woke up in a hospital chained to the bed, surrounded by police, nurses, and news cameras eager to document the capture of a young man who had already become a minor celebrity through crime reporting. What made his case genuinely unusual wasn't the killing that preceded his arrest. It was what came after. Sentenced initially to well over 100 years, Pedro continued killing once inside the Brazilian prison system, targeting fellow inmates, largely those he specifically identified as rapists or other violent criminals. During one prison transfer, handcuffed in the back of a police vehicle alongside another inmate, he managed to kill the man without officers in the front noticing, later explaining simply that the victim had admitted to being a rapist. He estimated killing roughly 10 inmates by breaking their necks, with the rest stabbed. According to Brazilian press accounts, he ultimately killed at least 47 people while incarcerated. Inside cells, prison yards, canteens, and transport vehicles, bringing his officially confirmed total to 71 murders across his entire life, and pushing his cumulative sentence past 400 years. Not every victim inside prison fit his stated code of only targeting other criminals. By his own later admission, at least one cellmate was killed simply for snoring too loudly, and Pedro described the thrill of killing as something he found genuinely satisfying in its own right, a detail that complicates his own self-framing as a purely principled vigilante. Authorities eventually placed him in psychiatric confinement, barred from contact with other prisoners, and later transferred him to Taubaté Maximum Security Prison, a facility with a custom-built annex specifically designed to house inmates considered too dangerous for the general prison population. A 1982 psychiatric evaluation concluded he displayed paranoid and antisocial traits, with his primary underlying motivation described by the examining psychiatrists as a violent assertion of his own identity. A criminologist who studied his case in depth characterized him not as a true vigilante acting from principle, but as an avenger, someone whose violence was fundamentally about targeting people he personally judged to be the worst of society, rather than any coherent moral framework. Pedro himself claimed, across numerous interviews over the years, that his true body count exceeded 100, well beyond the 71 he was officially convicted of. Journalists who investigated these claims found his accounts frequently shifted in detail from one telling to the next, and noted that Brazilian prison record-keeping through the 1970s was chaotic enough that authorities often had to rely entirely on spoken testimony to confirm individual killings, making it likely, by most informed assessments, that he killed somewhat fewer than his own claims, but almost certainly more than his official conviction record fully captured. Because Brazilian law at the time capped total imprisonment at 30 years regardless of sentence length, Pedro was released in 2007 after serving 34 years total. He was briefly imprisoned again in 2011 for inciting a riot and unlawfully detaining someone, ultimately released again in 2018 after 7 years of good behavior. Following that second release, he publicly declared himself reformed, renouncing his self-described vigilantism and vowing to commit no further violence. He became something of a minor celebrity, running a YouTube channel under the name Pedrinho X Matador, X Killer Petey, where he commented on contemporary crime stories and specifically campaigned against gang violence, urging young viewers not to romanticize the criminal life that had defined his own. That reinvention ended violently. On March 5, 2023, at around 10 in the morning in Mogi das Cruzes, Pedro was shot by unidentified assailants firing from a car. One of them got out afterward and finished him with a knife to the throat, nearly decapitating him. Witnesses reported he had been carrying a child in his arms at the moment of the attack. The child was unharmed. No suspects were ever identified or arrested. Pedro Rodriguez Filho remains one of the most extensively documented cases of youth violence anywhere in the world, specifically because so much of his life played out in public. Interviews, an autobiography, a YouTube channel. Even as huge portions of his actual criminal history remain, by his own admission and independent journalists' assessments, impossible to fully verify. His story is also widely credited as the direct real-world inspiration behind the fictional character of Dexter Morgan, the vigilante serial killer at the center of the American novel and television series of the same name. What makes his case worth including here, despite the uncertainty around its exact scope, is what it demonstrates: that the psychological drivers behind extreme youth violence aren't confined to a single profile. Where most killers on this list targeted the vulnerable and unsuspecting, Pedro constructed an entire identity and public persona around a distorted, self-serving sense of justice. One that, decades later, still couldn't fully protect him from the same violence he had spent his life both perpetrating and, in his telling, avenging. The next case moves back to the United States, to a name that will likely be more familiar to you than any other on this entire list, because the boy at the center of it grew up to become one of the most infamous killers in American criminal history. Most people who instantly recognize the name Edmund Kemper know him for the murders he committed as an adult in California during the early 1970s. A string of killings that eventually included his own mother, and that made him one of the most extensively interviewed serial killers in American criminal history, providing investigators with some of the clearest documented insight ever obtained into the psychology behind repeat homicide. Far fewer people know how his violence actually began, nearly a decade earlier, when Kemper was 15 years old. Kemper's childhood was marked by instability from the start. His parents divorced in 1957, and he moved with his mother, Clarnell, and two sisters to Montana, where his relationship with her deteriorated badly. Already unusually large for his age and struggling socially, he was, according to his own later accounts, forced by his mother to sleep in the basement, away from his sisters, out of fear he might harm them somehow, an arrangement that left him isolated during exactly the years he most needed connection. He tortured and killed small animals during this period, and had already begun developing violent fantasies that blended sexual and aggressive elements. At his own request, he was sent to live with his father and stepmother in Los Angeles, hoping for something better. His father's new family found him just as unmanageable as his mother had, and within a relatively short time, frightened and unsure what to do with him, his father sent him away as well, this time to his paternal grandparents, Edmund Sr. and Maud Kemper, on their 17-acre ranch in North Fork, California. Kemper hated it there. He described his grandfather as senile and largely harmless, but felt his grandmother, Maud, treated him with open contempt. He later said she seemed to take pleasure in undermining him at every opportunity, treating him as though she needed to prove she had more authority than any man in the household, including her own husband. He'd already begun learning to handle firearms before arriving, and at the ranch he spent hours in the surrounding brush, shooting birds and small animals, partly, by his own account, specifically to irritate his grandmother, who objected to killing for its own sake. Eventually his grandfather confiscated the rifle at Maud's insistence, a punishment that only deepened Kemper's simmering resentment, since the gun had functioned as one of his only real outlets for the aggression building inside him. Through the summer of 1964, tension in the household grew steadily worse. Kemper's violent fantasies increasingly centered on his grandmother specifically. He later admitted to imagining shooting her, lining her up unaware in his rifle sights just to consider what it would feel like. Maud, apparently sensing something was wrong, began taking her husband's .45 pistol with her whenever she left the property, worried it might fall into her grandson's hands in her absence, a precaution Kemper took as a deep personal insult, one he brooded over rather than understood. On August 27, 1964, Kemper was sitting with his grandmother at the kitchen table, helping her review proofs for a children's book she was writing for Boys' Life magazine. Something in their ongoing argument finally broke. Kemper picked up his grandfather's .22 rifle, pointed it through the screen door, and shot her in the back of the head. She slumped forward onto the table. He fired twice more, striking her in the back, then, uncertain whether she was actually dead, retrieved a butcher knife from the kitchen and stabbed her several additional times. When his grandfather returned home from a grocery run shortly afterward and began unloading the truck in the driveway, Kemper went outside and shot him as well, at close range. Confused and frightened, not by what he'd done, but by the practical certainty that he would be caught, since his grandparents weren't the kind of people who could simply vanish without their absence being noticed almost immediately. Kemper called his mother in Montana. She told him to call the sheriff. He did, and waited at the property for police to arrive. Under questioning, he confessed readily to both killings. Asked why he'd killed his grandmother, he reportedly said, in words that have since become widely cited in criminological literature, that he had simply wanted to know what it would feel like. He offered a very different explanation for his grandfather's death, framing it almost as an act of mercy. He said he hadn't wanted the older man to come home and discover his wife's body, or to have to live with the grief and shock of it. Kemper was placed in juvenile custody while the California Youth Authority determined what to do with him. Court-appointed psychiatrists initially diagnosed him as a paranoid schizophrenic, and he was committed to Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security psychiatric facility, in December of 1964. Intelligence testing during his stay placed his IQ at 145, solidly in the genius range, and staff described him, somewhat unsettlingly given what he'd done, as an introspective, cooperative model patient who took genuine pride in his assigned work. Later psychiatric reassessments found no evidence of the hallucinations, delusions, or disordered thinking that would typically support a schizophrenia diagnosis, and his condition was revised to a milder classification: personality trait disturbance, passive-aggressive type, a shift reflecting real, unresolved disagreement among the professionals treating him over what, clinically, was actually wrong with him. During his time at Atascadero, Kemper was even trained to help administer psychiatric evaluations to other inmates, a role some later observers believed gave him valuable insight into exactly how to present himself convincingly to the very professionals responsible for deciding when he might be safe to release. That release came in 1969, at 21 years old, back into his mother's custody, a decision that, viewed with the full benefit of hindsight, is almost universally regarded by criminologists today as a catastrophic misjudgment of the danger he still posed. What followed, beginning in 1972, was an entirely new killing spree targeting young women, most of them college students he picked up while they were hitchhiking near Santa Cruz. He described experiencing what he called his little zapples, sudden, specific homicidal urges, and estimated he'd picked up roughly 150 hitchhikers he simply let go unharmed before he began acting on those urges with anyone at all. His first two victims, Mary Ann Pesce and Anita Lucchesa, disappeared in May of 1972. A young dance student, Aiko Koo, followed in September, killed after Kemper choked her unconscious and raped her, then later described, in his own words, admiring her body in his trunk like a fisherman admiring a catch. Two more victims followed in early 1973, killed with a firearm rather than by strangulation. On February 5th, using a university parking permit his own mother had given him, Kemper drove onto the UC Santa Cruz campus, picked up two more students, shot them both in his car, and drove calmly back past campus security with their bodies still inside. Weeks later, in April of 1973, Kemper killed his mother, Clarnell, at her home, followed by one of her close friends. He then called police himself and confessed in full detail, later explaining that turning himself in had been a deliberate choice, a way of making certain someone finally stopped him before he could continue. At trial in 1973, a jury rejected his insanity defense and found him sane and guilty on 8 counts of first-degree murder. Kemper himself requested the death penalty. California's capital punishment system was suspended at the time, and he received 8 concurrent life sentences instead, and remains incarcerated today at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. What makes Kemper's inclusion on this list so significant isn't the scale of his later, far more widely known killings. It's the fact that his first two victims, killed when he was only 15, are so rarely discussed in comparison to what came after. Long before Edmund Kemper became one of the most extensively studied serial killers in American history, he was simply a teenager who had already killed twice, and who was released back into the world by a system that badly, catastrophically underestimated exactly what he would go on to become. From one of the most infamous names in all of American criminal history, the next case brings us to the most recent entry on this entire list. A stark reminder that this isn't only a story confined to history. Belgrade, Serbia, on the morning of May 3, 2023, was the site of a school shooting that shocked the country to a degree few in the region could remember experiencing. Precisely because mass shootings of this kind, despite Serbia's substantial civilian gun ownership left over from the wars of the 1990s, had essentially never happened at a Serbian school before. 13-year-old Kosta Keksmanovic attended the Vladislav Ribnikar Model Elementary School in Belgrade's Vračar district, a school serving students roughly ages 6 through 15. By classmates' accounts, he was a quiet student with good grades, someone described afterward as not especially open with others, but giving no obvious sign of what he was planning. Police later determined he had spent roughly a month preparing the attack in meticulous detail, sketching out the school's classrooms and compiling a written list of specific people he intended to target. At around 8:40 that morning, Kekmanovic entered the school and pulled a handgun from his backpack, first shooting and killing the school's security guard. Moving through the hallway, he shot and killed 2 hall monitors, both girls, reloading his weapon as he made his way toward his own classroom. Once inside, he shot at his history teacher before opening fire on his classmates, killing 7 more students, 6 of them girls, and wounding 5 others. He was carrying 2 firearms belonging to his father, a licensed 9mm pistol and a .22 caliber pistol, along with 4 unused Molotov cocktails. He then made his way out through the hallway into the school courtyard and contacted police himself, roughly 2 minutes after officers had already received an initial call reporting the shooting. He surrendered without resistance. Local news footage showed him being led to a police vehicle with his head covered. In total, 9 people died at the scene, 8 students and the security guard. A 10th victim, a critically injured girl named Angelina Akimovich, died of her wounds on May 15th, nearly 2 weeks later, despite emergency surgery. Several other students required extensive treatment. One boy, wounded in the spine, later underwent surgery in Chicago. The history teacher, 52-year-old Tatiana Stevanovich, was shot 3 times and, according to later reporting, lost the ability to walk or move her left arm as a result of her injuries. Because Serbian law sets the minimum age of criminal responsibility at 14, Kecmanovic, 13 at the time of the attack, could not be criminally charged for the killings themselves, regardless of their scale or the degree of premeditation involved. He was instead placed under psychiatric care at a facility in Belgrade, where he has remained since. Legal proceedings instead focused on his parents. His father was charged with offenses related to public safety for failing to properly secure the firearms, and his mother was charged with unlawful weapon possession. In December of that year, both parents were convicted. His father received a sentence of 14.5 years, and his mother 3 years. A gun instructor who had previously taught Kecmanovic how to use a firearm also received a prison sentence for his role. In July of 2023, Kecmanovic was formally questioned as part of the case against his father, appearing via video link from the psychiatric facility for a session that lasted roughly 4 hours, with lawyers representing several victims' families present. During that questioning, he reportedly told investigators he had gotten the idea for the attack partly after watching a documentary that discussed mass murder, and mentioned playing a tactical shooter video game. He described his home life as largely without strict rules. His only real form of discipline, he said, had been having his phone confiscated, and characterized his relationships with both parents as warm, describing his mother as caring, intelligent, and fair. He said he missed his father, mother, sister, dog, and uncle. The attack triggered immediate, sweeping policy responses across Serbia. 3 days of national mourning were declared, and the country moved quickly toward tightened firearm storage regulations and new school security measures, including calls for metal detectors in schools that previously had none. The tragedy also reopened a broader national conversation about the sheer volume of firearms still circulating from the conflicts of the 1990s, and about the deeper social strain some commentators argued was contributing to violence like this: economic hardship, ongoing instability, and, as one former student put it afterward, a wider culture that has normalized violence across media and public life more broadly. Serbia's education minister, in contrast, publicly attributed the attack to what he described as corrosive foreign online influences and video game culture, a characterization that drew its own share of public criticism and debate. Kecmanovic's case is included here not because it fits the strictest traditional definition of a serial killer, but because of exactly what it represents: proof that the pattern this entire list has traced, through Boston in the 1870s, through Toronto in the 1950s, through Bihar in 2007, is not something confined safely to history. It remains fully capable of happening, in real time, anywhere in the world, even now. Which brings us, finally, to our last case. And in many ways, it's the one that started this entire conversation in the first place, because no name on this list has been studied, debated, and argued over more extensively than hers. We spent time earlier tonight with Mary Bell's case, the 10-year-old whose killings shocked all of England in 1968. We return to her now, at the very close of this list, because no case discussed tonight better illustrates the central, unresolved question this entire episode has been quietly circling from the very beginning. Mary was released from HM Prison Ascombe Grange in May of 1980, at 23 years old, having served nearly 11 and a half years in custody. She was granted a new legal identity, allowing her to settle somewhere in the country under an assumed name. In 1984, she gave birth to her only child, a daughter who grew up entirely unaware of her mother's past. That protection held for roughly 18 years. In 1998, journalists tracked Belle and her then 14-year-old daughter to a resort town on England's south coast, where the two had been quietly living together. The discovery forced them to flee under police escort to a safe house, and prompted Belle, working with journalist Gitta Sereny, to finally give her own account of events through the book Cries Unheard, a decision that brought her both the harshest public criticism of her adult life and eventually a landmark legal protection. In 2003, Belle won a high court ruling granting herself and her daughter lifelong anonymity, on the grounds that the case's genuinely exceptional circumstances justified it, a ruling that has since become known in British legal shorthand simply as a Mary Belle order. The presiding judge specifically noted that Belle had raised her daughter into what she described as a charming, well-balanced young woman, and that mother and daughter had built a largely settled, ordinary life together in the years since her release. That protection was extended further in 2009, when it emerged that Belle had become a grandmother. The child, referred to in court documents only as Z, was granted the same lifelong anonymity as her mother and grandmother. When the news became public, June Richardson, the mother of Belle's first victim, 4-year-old Martin Brown, by then in her 60s, gave a response that captured, perhaps better than anything else connected to this case, the impossible weight it still carries for the families left behind. A child, she said, is a blessing. Belle had taken hers and left her with nothing but grief for the rest of her life. She said she hoped that every time Belle looked at her own grandchild, she would remember the 2 children she had murdered, children whose own families would never get to hold a grandchild of their own because of what Belle had done. Belle has spoken publicly, under carefully controlled and fully anonymous circumstances, only a small handful of times since her release, generally through her cooperation with Sereny rather than direct media appearances. In those accounts, she described a childhood almost purpose-built in the assessment of several psychologists who later reviewed her case to produce exactly the kind of violence that followed. A mother who, by multiple family members' accounts, resisted even holding her at birth, who was later accused of attempting to harm her through a series of suspicious childhood accidents, and who Belle alleged, though this was never independently corroborated beyond her own and her family's testimony, exposed her to sexual abuse from a young age. Belle has said she didn't fully speak about this history until after her mother's death in 1995, describing her mother as having spent years in denial as her own way of managing the guilt. And yet, courts, journalists, and criminologists who have studied her case for well over 5 decades now remain genuinely divided on the central question at its heart: whether Mary Belle's crimes are best understood as the inevitable, tragic result of her circumstances, or whether, as with several other names discussed tonight, there was something present in her from the very start that no environment alone could ever fully explain. It's the same fundamental question raised by Amarjeet Sada, killing infants at 8 years old with no documented history of extreme abuse behind him. The same question raised by Edmund Kemper, whose violence first emerged at 15 and resurfaced, entirely unchanged, after years of dedicated psychiatric treatment. The same question Peter Woodcock answered, in the most direct and undeniable way imaginable, within the very first opportunity he was ever given to prove otherwise. Across all 17 cases discussed tonight, spanning more than 150 years and touching nearly every inhabited continent, the surface details change considerably. The ages, the specific methods, the circumstances that led each of these children toward violence. But the question sitting at the center of every single one of them remains exactly, precisely the same, and remains, even now, without any clean or satisfying answer. What actually separates a child capable of this from every other child who experiences comparable hardship and simply doesn't become this? Nobody, not the psychologists, not the courts, and certainly not the killers themselves, has ever been able to fully answer that question. That's ultimately what makes these 17 cases worth returning to. Not the violence itself, but the vast, unresolved space sitting quietly underneath it. The space where explanation finally runs out, and something else entirely, something still not fully understood by anyone, takes over instead.